So earlier this month, Sony released Madam Web, which was one of their new pseudo Spider-Man movies about the comic book character. I believe it's in the same universe as Venom and Morbius and their other pseudo Spider-Man movies. You know, the movies about Spider-Man villains without Spider-Man in them themselves. And it's already become one of the internet's favorite movie to hate, because that happens every now and then when there's a movie that the internet likes to pile on, I should say. There's been a lot of things said about it. It's been called the worst comic book movie of all time. It's been called the worst movie of all time, period. Every time I go on Twitter or TikTok, I feel like every other post is something related to Madam Web or about how supposedly terrible it is. I haven't seen the movie. I have no thoughts on the movie itself, but I think some interesting discourse has come out of it. In fact, popular YouTube film reviewer Chris Stuckman did a video not reviewing Madam Web, but making a video about the circumstances that Madam Web came from, how a movie like Madam Web got made. And this is the intro of what he had to say, which was controversial to say the least.
Probably not going to do a video for this one based off of what I've heard, since I do try to keep it mostly about film celebration on this channel. Having seen the film, I'm going to tell you that this is not a movie review of Madam Web. I am not about bashing filmmakers, artists. I know how hard it is to make a movie. I do not know how hard it is to make a movie under the studio system. I was able to make an indie film without a giant corporation breathing down my neck, which is not the privilege that S.J. Clarkson had when she directed Madam Web under Sony, which I can only imagine was monumentally difficult. This is not going to be a video about Madam Web and telling you whether or not you should see Madam Web. There are plenty of people on this platform, as well as a website dedicated to aggregating reviews and giving it a number that's going to inform you of that, and you can choose to listen to those voices if you want. The information is out there. What I am compelled to make a video about is something that I heard pretty much every writer, some directors, and most actors bashing last year, and that is movie studios.
That's what Chris had to say at the beginning of his video, and it's a very fascinating video where he talks about the studio system and how artists are affected by studio meddling and different systemic choices and things that happen in Hollywood. And I think it's a very interesting video, but he caught a lot of flack for his intro. And I think there were people on one side who agreed with Chris. A lot of creatives I saw, a lot of people in general, who found it a very reasonable and, I guess, level-headed way to approach film criticism. Because their argument is, if you don't like a movie that's made by the Hollywood studio system, and you can sense that there was studio meddling within it, point the finger not at the filmmakers, who often don't have the autonomy to fight for themselves and be able to make those choices. Rather, let's point a finger at the studio heads and the executives and the producers and the high up studio people who frequently are out of touch with movies and what people would like and what this movie should or shouldn't be. That was one side of the reaction to what Chris Stuckman had to say. And the other side came down pretty hard on him. They were saying things like, that's a cop-out, that's unfair. If you're paying a lot of money to see a movie in a movie theater, we should absolutely be able to trash and talk about how awful a movie is. And we should be able to blame the filmmakers for choosing to, even though they don't have the choice then, they had the choice to make a movie within Hollywood or not. And there's a lot of people who took issue with what Chris had to say. And I think this is a really interesting discussion because obviously over the last several decades, filmmaking has become increasingly democratized, as has film criticism or film reviewership and writing about filmmaking in movies in general. It's made me think about how we talk about movies and how we review movies and the types of discussions and discourse that I see online. If some of you who've been following us for a while might know about, we made a video a few years ago where we talked about how we felt it was very poor taste for a filmmaker to bash or trash talk another filmmaker. And I still stand by that video. I think that comes across as some, classless and tasteless, and it's just not needed, and it seems a little bit unprofessional. But there were people who perhaps they misunderstood us at the time, or maybe they didn't. We had certainly a large number of reactions back then as well. But there were people who were very adamant that, you know, film criticism is important. It should be continued. And our response was, we never said it wasn't. We didn't say that it was, unimportant. We just said that if you're going to trash talk a movie or a filmmaker, that seems a little bit rude to do as a filmmaker yourself, which is a completely different thing than film criticism. So I think among the way filmmakers and cinephiles talk about movies, I think there is even maybe some confusion about the difference between all of those things. So I thought today, because of Madam Web and also Avatar: The Last Airbender coming out, the new Netflix show, I've seen a lot of discourse online talking about, critiquing or reviewing these shows and these movies. And quite frankly, I think the audience who's been critical of The Last Airbender live action series, I think for the most part, they've done a very well job at giving a proper criticism rather than just, trash talking or bashing a movie. All that to say, I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about where I come from as a filmmaker, my thoughts on the whole subject matter of film discourse and film criticism and all that. And I guess before I get into my thoughts, I feel like first I have to define my view, my perspective. So in my opinion, when I think of film criticism, I have to divide film criticism into 3 different categories. And the first one is film analysis. And a film analysis doesn't necessarily condemn or condone a movie or talk about its merits or qualities or blemishes. Instead, what an analysis does, it's a way to help guide the reader to interpret a movie. It's a way of helping us understand or read a movie in a different way, in a new way, looking at it from a different lens. For instance, a very basic example here, you could do a reading of the movie The Matrix about how that movie is kind of like a retelling of Plato's allegory of the cave or the myth of Ur, how The Matrix goes back to an older tradition of storytelling. And that would be a way you could do an analysis of The Matrix. You could write a beautiful paper, or perhaps you could do a video essay explaining your case, arguing your case, providing evidence for why evidence within the text, within the film, supports your argument and your claim that this movie is a retelling of the allegory of the cave. And that's kind of what I think of analysis when I think about film. The first category of film writing or film criticism is it doesn't say this is good, this is bad. This is purely just, this is how we are supposed to read the movie, or this is one way to read the movie. This is how I read the movie, and explain to others your perspective on that. The second category, I would say, of film criticism would be the review. Now, the review is probably the layman's version of a critique or criticism. Again, this is all my opinion, but in my opinion, a review is simply just someone's opinion on a movie. It is someone who goes to a movie or watches it at home and likes it or doesn't like it, and talks about why they didn't like it or why they did like it, and talks about, should you see this movie as well? Is this movie worth seeing? What's, valuable within this movie? And I think that's what is probably the most popular form of film criticism out there, is the review. It's someone explaining why they didn't or did like the movie, or why a movie's good or bad, that sort of thing. It's very opinionated generally. I mean, it's art, so it's all to an extent opinionated, but a review even more so. It's the most popular form of film criticism, I think. And again, because of the democratization of digital media and technology, there's a lot, everybody in the world can write a movie review with apps, like IMDb, Letterboxd. I believe Rotten Tomatoes also has an audience section where you can write your reviews as well. YouTube review culture certainly has added to this ability to share your opinions and thoughts and reviews of a movie. There's been somewhat of a movie making or movie reviewing culture that has come up in the last 10, 15 years or so as technology's grown. that's the second category of film criticism, I think. There's analysis, there's a review, which is just an opinion. And then thirdly, which is I think is the most valuable to the filmmakers, is criticism. It's kind of self-explanatory, but again, I think it's good to define these things. And I think criticism, or good film criticism, is a critique on a film based on the intentions of the filmmakers. You have to look at a movie at what it's trying to accomplish, because it would be unfair to call a movie like Halloween too violent, right? Because it's a horror movie. If you don't like horror, or if you don't like violent movies, it kind of doesn't make sense why you're blaming Halloween for being too violent, when that's kind of what horror movies are known for. So you have to, good criticism, you have to meet the film where it's at. You have to look at a film and what the intention of the filmmakers are, what it is. And then from there, you evaluate the film's merits and blemishes based on if it's trying to add to that experience or take away from that experience. For instance, another example, this doesn't happen in the movie Halloween, but if in the movie Halloween there was a scene in which Michael Myers started talking and said a poop and fart joke, that would probably make Michael Myers not seem very scary, because the intention of the film and the idea behind Michael Myers is that he is unknown and that he is scary, and you kind of project your own imagination onto him as a character. So if Michael Myers in the first Halloween movie were to lift up his mask and say a poop gag or joke or anything, that would take away from him being scary. And so that would be a choice that detracts from the intentions of the filmmakers, right? So, and on the flip side, if, in the movie Halloween, it's really great that Michael Myers never says a word. That really adds to him being a scary, almost supernatural force that you don't quite comprehend and understand. And so a good critique is looking at all the choices that the filmmakers make and talks about, do we think that those choices added to their intentions? Was it working towards their intentions, or was it working against their intentions? And if it wasn't, offering suggestion on how to fix it. And that's what I think of when I think of good film criticism, proper film criticism, the criticism that's the most valuable to the filmmaker. I think when we made our video a few years ago, we talked about how Doom Productions, I know specifically just us, and to an extent now just me, because I can really only speak for myself. We don't read reviews of our work, which is because, quite honestly, we don't always know where people are coming from. And that's really hard to discern genuine criticism and trolls and, what kind of voices you're hearing from different people out there. And I think people interpreted that as we can't take criticism, or we don't like criticism. And that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, the reason we don't take criticism from online strangers, from everybody, is because, there's that age-old saying, you wouldn't take a criticism from someone you wouldn't take advice from someone you don't trust, right? And so you never know where people online are coming from. So instead, what we much prefer to do is we have filmmaking friends, and we have fellow filmmakers and people who are into the film scene and all that, and we show our work to them, and we get their feedback and we get their input. Our friends don't, it might sound like we're hiding from the real world, honest feedback and opinion, but we go to our friends because we trust them above all else to know where our intentions are coming from, because we're able to talk about them with it, what we were trying to do with the movie. And we can trust them to be 100% honest, because we're all filmmakers and we all understand and we get it. And so that experience is really valuable, to show your movie to another person who understands what you're trying to do and can see from an outside perspective if your film, or if your choices within the film, reflect your intentions. It's a really valuable thing when you're a filmmaker, because you never can quite see your movie the same way that other people can. And so having a filmmaker sit down with you, or someone who just likes movies, and talking about, hey, this choice you made here was really great. This really added to this feeling of suspense. Or they might say something like, oh, this choice you made right here took me out of the movie, and I was no longer emotionally engaged with the scene. And from that point on, I was a little bit lost in the story. right? Those are all wonderful things to hear when you're editing your movie and when you're working on your movie. And that's why I think film criticism is really, really good, because even after your movie is released, you can still get that kind of feedback from your peers and fellow critics and stuff like that. Because obviously, I think, it's your right to shut out all criticism. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I think to a certain extent, for myself, certainly, I want to improve on every movie I make. I want to get better as a filmmaker. And there's no way for me to do that if I'm unaware of how people perceive my movies and how people feel about my movies and what effect I'm having on the audience. And so having a good space to be able to do that is really, really wonderful. And what's also great is if you are consulting with fellow filmmakers about this, they usually can offer suggestions on how to fix whatever problems you might have had in your film, which is really, really valuable. This is also really great in the stage of collaboration when you're working with other people. I mean, I know for sure I'm editing a movie. I made a big feature film last summer with my friends called Little Black Submarines. It's hopefully going to be out this summer. And recently, I've been editing on it a whole bunch. And in that process, I've shown it to friends and we've gone back and forth about what's working, what's not working, all that sort of thing. And I thought the movie was pretty much done until about, a couple weeks ago when I got a really wonderful note from my buddy Caleb Robinson from RC Films, who's a filmmaker. Check out his work. He made Not So Amazing, Hotel, was a producer and the DP on The Mentor, which just came out. But anyways, Caleb gave a note which I had never thought about before. I'd never considered doing what he suggested, and I know I can't be too I don't want to spoil anything, but I thought, that's an interesting note. I'm just going to try it. And then I edited the movie, including Caleb's note, and the movie just clicked. It became that much better. I never would have thought about it. I wasn't resistant to the idea, but I thought, hey, I'm just going to try it. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, I'll leave it in. I'll ignore that note. But I tried it, and the movie's better because of it. And so that's really one of the wonderful things about filmmaking. And I think that's kind of also a long-winded way of saying, hey, Doom Productions, we do listen to notes. We do take people's feedback into consideration, but just from people we trust. We don't listen to every single voice on the internet, because there's a lot of voices on the internet and you never know where people are coming from. Taking a step back and looking at all those three different forms of film critique and film criticism, I think that the best film critics are able to do all three of those things at once. They're able to analyze a movie, they're able to review a movie, and they're also able to critique a film. And that's a really wonderful, valuable thing for there to be in the world, for people to have a discussion about art and films in general. What I don't think is as helpful, which is what I've seen happening with the Madam Web situation, which, again, I guess you should preface by saying, if you want to bash a movie, if you want to trash talk a movie, that's fine. That's your right, and that's your prerogative. We live in a world where we have the freedom of choice, and we have rights of free speech. And I think it's a beautiful thing that if you hate a movie, you can talk about how bad it is. You can trash talk about it. That's your right, and that's your freedom. But oftentimes, when someone trashes a movie, what I do see is someone will bash a movie, they'll go really hard on something. And then when that person is called out on that and said, hey, I don't think that's very productive, the person who was bashing the movie then turns around and says, well, actually, film criticism is important. Looking at movies and talking about movies is important. And this is a valuable thing I'm contributing to society, is this discourse on art and criticism. And I should be able to call out movies and yada, yada, yada. And listen, again, that's your right. But I don't think bashing a movie is as useful as genuine film criticism. Because there is a difference. There's a tremendous difference between film criticism and bashing a movie. Bashing a movie is often hyperbolic. There's a lot of bad faith criticism. A lot of times it's attacking the character of the artist behind the movie. So it wouldn't just be something like an example of criticism might be, I think that this director was concerned with an unimportant aspect of the story and focused on that rather than something that I think was more interesting, right? That would be something that you might hear in film criticism. But trashing a movie would say something like, I think the filmmaker was terrible. they did a terrible job at making this movie, they didn't understand the material, right? Yada, yada, yada. That's not criticism, that's bashing and perhaps bullying to a certain extent. Bashing a movie, often there's no real genuine suggestions on how to change it or how to try to fix it. It's entertaining, sure. Isn't that how Red Letter Media got really popular, taking down the prequels and also just general online film reviewers, all right? I think that a lot of people has become popular to bash stuff. And so clearly there's an audience for it, and clearly it is entertaining. But where I push back on this whole culture of bashing movies and being relentlessly negative on movies is it's not important. I don't think it's as important as genuine film criticism. Because at the end of the day, when you bash a movie or trash talk a filmmaker as an audience member, it's generally done to tear filmmakers down. And good criticism should always inspire filmmakers to do better. And easy example of that, I've been in situations where I've shown my movie to friends and people, and they have not liked my movie. They didn't like a choice I made. They thought, they didn't agree with everything I did within the movie, and that's fine. I'm not offended by that. But what happens is afterwards, they give me comments, or we have a discussion, and we talk about those choices and how I could have made my intentions more clear or avoided certain pitfalls and that sort of thing. And even if I've walked away from a conversation with a friend who doesn't like something I've made, I always feel inspired to do better. And I don't see how, if the filmmakers behind Madam Web, sat down with any of these people criticizing the movie and tearing it apart and ripping it to shreds, I don't think they'd walk away from those conversations feeling inspired to do better. I think they'd feel pretty down on themselves. I don't know what help those conversations would be to them, quite frankly. And I know what people might say to that. There are rich directors in Hollywood. It's a whole Hollywood system. Why do you need someone to defend them? All that. I know. It sounds kind of, it's a first world problem. Let's be honest. It's movies, and talking about movies. It's, I think there's more important things going on in the world right now. I think that film bashing is, quite frankly, just not very helpful to the filmmakers. And so I don't personally see a point in participating in it or reading it or watching it or anything like that. I'm much more interested in people who use their writing of movies, their writing about the movies, their criticism of movies as a way to elevate the form of cinema and have high standards for it, right? Because that's part of the way that cinema was born. If I'm remembering correctly, about 100 years ago, well, more than 100 years ago, films were not considered to be highbrow art. They weren't considered to be, good art, tasteful art. And there were a lot of people at the time, not film reviewers, right? Because films were a new thing. There were doctors, there were psychologists, there were philosophers. There was a lot of academics who were writing about filmmaking and cinema and movies. And they thought of the art form very highly. Hugo Munsterberg is a guy who comes to mind. And they wrote about movies in a way that made people appreciate them more and have a new understanding for the art form, rather than just dismissing movies as a, lowbrow form of art. What these film reviewers, or I guess pseudo proto film reviewers at the time, these academics who were writing about films, they were elevating the medium and holding it in high regard. And that was something that was very important for movies at the time. And I think, obviously, the context has changed about movies right now, but I think that film reviewers and critics have an opportunity to hold films to a high standard and to elevate cinema as an art form, rather than just turning it into a horrible discourse mess of a conversation with lots of hyperboles and insults thrown around and all that kind of thing. Because I'm gonna be honest, people complain about the state of filmmaking, and there's that's another conversation entirely. But at the same time, the state of film discourse is equally concerning, in my opinion, because most film criticism these days is really just people bashing films, but it's being disguised as criticism, usually with wordplay to elevate, to make the writer seem like a really smart person, right? These reviews are usually done to make the reader have a high opinion of the writer and be in awe of their genius use of words and wordplay and how they turn a phrase and all that sort of thing, all while diminishing the hard work of others to elevate themselves and celebrate their own genius. When really, I think good film critics should always be celebrating movies and celebrating cinema. I guess that's kind of the point I've been trying to make, is that I think that we need to change as a I don't know what you call it, as in the people within the film space. I think changing the way we talk about movies and being aware of how we talk about movies would do a lot of good, I think. Would help filmmakers out for sure, I think. Again, and I'm not telling you not to give film criticism. I am not saying that film criticism is not important. I'm not even saying that you shouldn't bash a movie. That's fine. That is your right to bash a movie. But I'm expressing my opinion that I think bashing a movie is not productive. And I think genuine film criticism is always more productive and more interesting to engage with. Even just a plain old review is more helpful because, right, it's someone talking about what they liked about a movie, what they didn't like, and if others should see that movie as well. I think that's more helpful than just everybody dogpiling on a movie, and then suddenly we get the opinion, we get the preconceived notion going into a movie that, oh, this is going to be terrible because everybody says it's going to be terrible. And again, I haven't seen Madam Web, but my sister saw Madam Web. And my sister said that she thought it was going to be the worst movie ever made. And she thought it was perfectly on par with a lot of other Marvel MCU movies that have already been made. She was disappointed that it wasn't as bad as she thought it was going to be. So, and I know I'm certainly guilty of having preconceived notions about movies going into them as well. And so, yeah, I'm here to say that, when you bash a film, I don't personally find it very productive, and I don't personally find it very useful and helpful. But film criticism and review and analysis, those are all very good things, I think. But bashing a film, I never think it's very helpful. Now, to backtrack to things I've brought up before, as I've said, at Doom Productions, we made a movie a few years ago about why you shouldn't trash talk other filmmakers if you're a filmmaker. So, this part's for you filmmakers. If you are a filmmaker, independent, amateur, just starting out, or professional, wherever you are in the spectrum, I do think that bashing a film is wrong. I do think that trash talking another filmmaker is wrong. I will stand by that. I'm not going to budge on that. I think if you've made a movie, you know how hard it is to make a movie. You become aware of all the different aspects and elements of filmmaking and all the different things you have to gather and assemble and orchestrate in order to film one scene, to film one shot, to make a movie. So when you've gone through the process of making a movie, more often than not, I think filmmakers or new filmmakers, they realize how much of a miracle it is that a movie gets made, period. That a movie just exists, because it is an uphill battle to get a film accomplished. Because if movies were a natural thing, movies would grow from trees, right? They'd sprout out of the ground. But movies are not a natural thing. Movies are a thing that filmmakers have to fight to create with other filmmakers, with a team. And sometimes they don't have teams, or sometimes they have teams of thousands of people, right? It's not a natural thing. Movies don't just spring out of the ground. Movies are made with love. They're crafted with love and care and hard work and blood, sweat, and tears and all that. And once you've gone through the experience of making a film and you know how hard it is to make a movie, it comes across as just classless to tear down another colleague and expect people to give your film the benefit of the doubt when you didn't give another filmmaker benefit of the doubt, even if the person is in Hollywood. Because, right, that's another argument I hear people say is, I'm a indie filmmaker. I'm not related to Hollywood. I'm not, I don't know anybody in Hollywood. They're so far above me. That's, it's okay to bash, big films and big filmmakers. And again, it's your right, but I think that's wrong. I think that even if the person's in Hollywood, you don't know what it's like to make a movie with that amount of pressure and at that level and with all the studio meddling that goes involved. That's the sucky thing about Hollywood films, is you never know how much of the original film, if that is in there, right? You don't know if the movie that we see is the movie that the filmmakers intended to make. And that's the bummer. And I think it comes across as just classless and tasteless and jealous too, when indie level filmmakers just bashing Hollywood filmmakers. I think it's kind of ridiculous and silly. Now, that's not to say you can't criticize the system of Hollywood. I'm all for, I have my own problems with Hollywood and that system, but going after people individually in Hollywood for making a movie that you didn't like, I think that's classless and tasteless. And besides, you never know if you're going to work with that person in the future. I mean, maybe you have no intentions of doing that, but it's the analogy I always kind of make is like, if you're a teacher working in a school, it is kind of rude to trash talk another teacher. If you're a first grade teacher and you're like, oh geez, that fifth grade teacher, I hate him, he does this and this is terrible. If you have a problem, go to them personally, behind closed doors, in private. That's what direct messages are for. If you have an issue with them, do it in private. Don't air your dirty laundry out in public. That's it's a little rude, and it comes across as immature and childish. I'm reading a book right now about Hayao Miyazaki. It's a collection of his writings. Do I have it anywhere? Lucky it's within reach. It's this book right here. In it, Miyazaki talked about how when he was working in television, the speed at which they were working at, it was very quick paced, very fast paced, and there was no room to really stop and think about anything. And he talks about that when you're in this industry, when you're working in the system together with people. This is what he says. He says, when you criticize another person's work at the workplace, you need to have an alternative plan and the ability to persuade others that your opinion is better. The workplace has no use for a critic. If you don't have this persuasive ability, you have to grit your teeth and work with the original scenario until you develop an assertive voice. This is a hard thing to do. Now, obviously, it's a very different context, very specific context to how he's working, but it just reminds me of that. If you do truly have a problem with a filmmaker's work, and you want to bash them, take it private. Use DMs like a normal person. Don't just insult a fellow filmmaker out in the open. And again, unless that filmmaker has personally wronged you in any way, I don't see the use in trash talking another filmmaker, right? Unless they're like, they've done something horribly morally reprehensible, like Roman Polanski or Woody Allen or something, right? Like, unless if for all intents and purposes it's just a normal person who just makes a movie that you don't like, don't trash talk them. It's kind of rude. On the flip side, if you put work out there, that the internet is a scary place, right? And we can never stop all the trolls and people who are creepy and weird out there from trashing you and bashing your movie, right? That's never going to stop. So I think fellow filmmakers, just because someone's trash talking you and trolling you, right? You put yourself out there when you put your work on the internet, when you release your films. To a certain extent, you have to be aware of the risks that you take when you do that. You open yourself to all sorts of people, and they are free to behave and do whatever they want, within the boundaries of the law, pretty much. So, but anyways, yeah, I've just been thinking about criticism and film discourse a lot lately, and that was just something that's been on my mind, and I wanted to share that with everybody else. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments down below. And at the end of the day, just try to remember too, movies are subjective, right? There's no right or wrong. You're free to do whatever you like when it comes to talking about movies. But yeah, it's all subjective. There are more important things going on in the world than just, what are people watching? What do people like and don't like? Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. Again, I'd love to hear people's thoughts down in the comments. And until the next video, have a good week.